This study looks at the perceptions of people who were interviewed in Colorado as part of a compilation of a linguistic atlas for the western states. It is not a perceptual study in the traditional sense, in that it does not look at the categorization of dialects and attitudes people have about these dialects, as has studies by such people as Preston and Tomasi. Rather, it examines the perception people have of lexical items in terms of where they're used and by whom. I like to call it words and the people who supposedly use them. The motivation for conducting this study was in part simply due out of personal curiosity, since having conducted and transcribed many of the interviews for the LAWS project, I knew that interviewees had made some observations about various words and associated them with different groups of people. And I was curious to see what patterns in these comments might be found and what they might reveal about language use and attitudes. As my dissertation is primarily a work in traditional atlas methodology, the current study is admittedly somewhat tangential to that purpose, but it seems to be a big part of counting. So like when I'm starting to count up these things, I'm trying to get a better sense of what these numbers mean. So looking at perceptions is one of those things I need to account for. And I also think that salience is an important part of dialect and probably consists both of relative frequency in the distribution of terms, as well as the perception of these features, and these two things are not necessarily exclusive. A little work has been done on the salience of lexical items, as mentioned by a few people. And so that's what I'm going to look at today is mostly lexical, actually all lexical, one phrase. There is some phonological commentary in the records, but I won't be talking about that today. Just to give you a brief summary of the LAWS interviews, I had an overhead, but it was actually for Elmo, and we didn't have that today, so I decided to opt out. Basically, it just gave a good idea of where we've interviewed so far. We've done 28 interviews in Colorado to cover a grid created by Lee Pedersen, and as part of this linguistic atlas, the Western States. And these interviews are conducted in rural communities, covering a lot in the plains and in the mountainous areas, and in the West as well. The grid was conducted or created based on historical factors as well as geographical, so it's pretty good spread. If anybody wants to see that map, I'll have it right here after. Basically, we transcribed the interviews. They're 3 hours long. There's 360 targets in these, all pretty much lexical and phonological, although grammatical comes out of the conversation that we encourage on some items. Basically, I have 19 of these interviews transcribed in full. So I looked at those. I used the Wordsmith program and just went through there looking for different keywords that came up that people use about these types of words. 17 of the 19 informants did use such words to describe items, even though that isn't what the interview was totally about. It was just seeing what kind of words people used in that area. They did offer a lot of commentary. On a few occasions, people, when they talked about these words, actually mentioned words for things associated with their region. In this case, the West. They talked about Western pants for Levi's, Western hats for cowboy hats, and so on. But for the most part, when people talked about the words they used, they didn't really make much of a comment on them being confined to a certain area. For the most part, we'll see some things that they did later on. People also talked about words that they associated with other languages, and I have mostly Spanish, words like arroyo, penco for orphan lamb, burro, hacienda. In an interview that I'm currently transcribing, the informant actually speaks of Spanish terms to a great length, and perhaps when I am able to include this interview in the entire study, we'll find that Spanish words are spoken about more than any other type of word or words that are associated with a certain type of person. Mexican Americans are talked about to an extent. They mentioned that one informant mentioned that the word pump was used exclusively by Mexican Americans that he knew for spigot. and then the word gringo was attributed to Mexican American. French words included trousers, I found a support for that, and veranda. Also German, such as Potty-Wurst, for food. Among other characterizations of English words, there were some that were deemed to be old-fashioned, older, or only used by old-timers. These included bastard for illegitimate child, chinook for a warm wind, head cheese, and rheumatism. One word was mentioned to be exclusively, was used exclusively by a single sex. One informant says that the word gentleman cow, or phrase gentleman cow for bull, was used only by women in the community. And two other people mentioned that word as being associated with specific women. One, his grandmother, and another, a person who he overheard who was trying to use the gentleman cow to put less attention on the word. She was using it as a euphemism, and he said she probably would have been better off if she hadn't used the phrase that nobody else in there was familiar with. It ended up bringing more attention than she probably wanted to it. Occupation was mentioned a little bit. Lister was reported to be used, quote, more by people in corn country. So that's kind of an interesting one. But another way that people characterize words, and what I'm going to focus on today, was with respect to their perceived geographic distribution. Most common comment was actually not where a word was used, but where it wasn't used, and that was not around here, or not in these parts. Words that were characterized as such included arroyo, bumpkins, and canucks. And objects like corn cribs, fireflies, and sycamore trees were mentioned in that group as well. For the northern part of the country, no terms were mentioned to be specifically northern, although a couple of objects were considered northern. Corn cribs, people would always just say, well, those are more in the north, and I assume that they meant north of them, maybe a little northeast in Nebraska and such. And other people mentioned a cold north wind, like a blue northerner, but these were things that were very much aware of these people. They weren't using the term to say that these things are only used in the north by any means. Eastern words associated with the east included looking glass, andirons, and tote. Some of the references people talked about were lightning bugs in eastern Kansas. And a little surprisingly to me, coffee cake was mentioned as being more of a thing in the east and south than in Colorado. I haven't been to that yet, though. The greatest number of characterizations when people did say things like that word is used more in this part of the country or that, though, was by far the south. On the handout, you have the words that people mentioned: chigger, kinfolk, pone, smearkasa, souse, sugan, sycamore, tote, and the phrase far piece, as in long distance.